Hello, in this video I'll discuss the basic hip movements that are common in any Latin dance exercise class. We're going to start with the hip bump. Here I have a skeletal hip model, and the hip bump is when the femur bone rises into the hip socket. So there's a hole there where your bones move together. So in the hip bump, your bone comes up into the hip socket. On me, it looks like this. Great. Now you could do this with straight legs, but usually we do it with our knees bent. Most students are good at this, but I've seldom seen a student who couldn't benefit from the next point. While your hip is going up, you actually need to think about your foot. The same foot is going down into the floor. That's how you'll get more power and more drama out of your move and burn a whole lot more calories. So while it looks like my hip is going up, up, I'm actually thinking about how my same foot is going down, down. And if you can think about that all the time while you're dancing, it'll help you out a lot. You really need to use your feet, push the ball of your foot down into the floor. So some moves you might do, you might go in a circle like that in your class. The next point is that at the same time you're doing this hip, you want something to happen to the opposite side of your rib cage. So if you watch my chest movement video, you'll learn how to do a chest slide. At the same time you're doing a hip bump, you're doing a chest slide on the opposite side. That way you have opposition between your chest and your hip. So if I don't do the chest slide and I do this, it looks a little boring. But if I add the chest slide, now it looks like a lot more action. Great, you'll want to try that on both sides. Now a great stretch for increasing your hip flexibility is just a simple Cleopatra stretch that I always do at the end of my class during the cool down. You want to sit into your hip as though you're sitting in a chair. Really let this part stretch that way. And at the same time, raise your opposite arm and feel that chest slide moving in the opposite direction of your hip. You want to keep your nose right on top of your navel. Hold it there for 30 to 60 seconds. Then try it on the other side. The hip bump is used in all sorts of Latin dance movements, even the salsa. I'm doing a hip bump with each step. Now what you want to think of is driving your foot into the floor. So when your hip goes up, that's when you're driving it into the floor with each step. Press, press, press with your feet. You'll be more grounded, you'll have better balance, and you'll use a whole lot more calories during your dance exercise class. Even in the cumbia, every time I step forward, my hip goes up, that forward foot is pressing down into the floor, backwards, pressing down. To learn the hip slide, try doing a simple side plank on the floor. Keep your hips and your legs on the floor and hold yourself up with your forearm. Now you're going to lift your hip off the floor, just your hip, keep your knees on the floor, go back down to neutral. Up, down, up, down. The movement that your hip is making is a hip slide. We want to feel how this feels on the floor and then transfer the feeling to a vertical position. So a hip slide looks like this on our skeletal model. And on me, it looks like this. Great. What you want to imagine is that there's some strings tied to the sides of your hips, and someone pulls the string this way and the other way. Reminds me of one of those Santa Claus figures at the Christmas stores at Christmas time. I've seen Santa doing this. Great. So when do we use this in our dance exercise classes? Try doing it at the same time as you step. step. So I'm hip sliding that way and stepping that way. This will happen during the reggaeton shuffle. Okay, so if you want to put more hip action into that reggaeton shuffle, you want to think about your hip slide. And a great stretch for practicing the hip slide is simply to stand best against a bar, or if you don't have one, a sturdy chair. Hold on to it, keep your feet under your armpits. Take your arm and bend toward the door or bend toward the bar. Really let your hip and your whole side fall away from the bar or the chair. You're going to stretch the whole side, and it's even going to cause your hip to do a hip slide. Now let's talk about the hip twist. A great way to understand the hip twist is to lie down on your side. Hold yourself up with your forearm. Make sure your legs are stacked one on top of the other. Now take your top leg and bring it forward till the knee touches the floor. And then back up. And then lift your knee so that your hip is going backwards and back to neutral. And keep moving between those positions. So you're twisting on the floor. The movement that your hips are doing is a hip twist. Good. Now when I'm standing up and doing a hip twist, I want to imagine that a coffee cup holder is on my vertebrae right about here, and somebody's turning it. So it's a spinal movement. I'm not going to show you the hip joint model for this because it is a spinal movement. From the front. So you want to try not to move your hands and just moving your hips around your spine. I feel like I'm rolling a Play-Doh snake. So here's my hands and my hips are the piece of Play-Doh, and I want to roll it so it gets skinnier and skinnier. And that's how you can get it going really fast, by imagining rolling that Play-Doh snake. Now at the same time, if I slow back down, your weight slightly transfers between your feet. So notice my legs and my feet are moving. I'm keeping my toes up, and I'm getting a real nice massage from side to side on my feet. A great stretch for practicing the hip twist. Down on the floor, legs in front of you, pick up one knee, put it over, drop that knee to the floor. You'll feel a nice stretch all through here. The next hip movement I want to show you is the hip rotator. On the skeletal model, it looks like this. This is very common in samba or hip hop, and it could happen a lot during your dance exercise class. Good. Now a lot of students are really good at this, but I have some safety tips and power tips for you. You always want to keep your toes in line with your knees. So a lot of students think they can't do this move because they have bad knees, but my knees aren't working at all. This move has nothing to do with my knees. It's all the motion is happening in the hip rotator. So notice how when my knee turns, my foot and my toes turn with it. The whole leg from hip joint to toes is moving as one unit. And that's really important so that you don't hurt your knees. It's also easier to do if you have proper shoes. Shoes with low tread bottoms, not too much tread, and a pivot point. Good. Now you can get more power out of this move if you imagine it's called cucaracha, cockroach. So while you're doing this, you want to imagine that you are squishing a cockroach on the floor. And so you want to press down with your foot, your whole leg going down into the floor, so you put lots of weight on top of that cockroach. Okay, try that on both sides. This is a very important step to do if you want to get that oozy Latin Cuban motion. For example, when we do some side steps, Notice how my feet are turning with my knee, and I'm doing that hip rotator motion. Slow, slow, and let your hip go with your knee and go with your toe. So it's important here that you step pigeon-toed so that you have room to turn your foot and knee out. Now I'd like to focus on the pelvic rock. On the skeletal hip joint model, it looks like this. From the side, and on me, okay, it's sometimes easier to learn this sitting in a chair because almost everybody does it while they're in the chair, but then they don't realize they can also do it while they're standing up. Just like we were doing with the chest pop, you want to imagine that you can slump in the chair. Everyone knows how to slump. And then sit up straight. Slump, sit up straight. This time, instead of focusing on the chest, think about what's happening down by your buttocks. Think about what's happening with your pelvic bone as you sit up straight and slouch. You really need to concentrate on that feeling because this is the same thing you're going to do while you're standing up. You can also practice the same thing on the floor. Turn this way. Right now, the small of my back is pressed into the floor. I can't get my hand under. But if I lift it up a little, I can get my whole arm under. And then put it back down. Up, down, up, down. Good. Let's try that standing up. Imagine you're still sitting in that chair. Imagine that your tailbone right here, push it in, and then it comes out. In, out, in, out. Also imagine right here, everything is flat. You can feel your whole skeleton right here. Then back, back, flat, back, flat. You can also think about your abs. This is like doing crunches on the floor. Another pelvic rock motion I do is like a calypso or hip hop step. I rock forward, I rock backward. This is different because here I'm crunching my abs, but in this one I'm keeping my abs stiff the whole time, but I'm not crunching them. And to this I like to add a calypso step. Finally, we'll just look at a knee raise and a swing back. Students don't have a problem with this, but I just wanted to show it. So often you do knee raises in your dance exercise class. The only advice here is just lift them higher to get more of a workout. And here's the swing back. Sometimes we might do this in swing. And squeeze those glutes behind you. Good. And on the hip joint model, just looks like this, right? Like you're kicking. And a great stretch for that, coming up, bring your knee close to you, hug it towards your chest, and stretch the other side. Hip flexor stretch.